world, and which unfortunately have survived even till today, all of that became part and parcel of society and of the government and of the king. And the simplest solution, therefore, was to get rid of the Jews. Hitler had a solution. He got rid of the Jews by killing them. The solution in the Middle Ages, even though many Jews were killed, but basically the solution in the Middle Ages was exile. The Jews were driven out of Spain, driven out of England, driven out of France. And the Jews were out of England for 500 years. It's only in the 18th century that they began to trickle back. The Sephardic Jews came in first. And they lived unofficially, because the decree was not revoked until the 19th century, till the Jew Bill was passed in the House of Parliament in the late 1800s, middle 1800s. But in the 1700s already there was a Jewish community. Oliver Cromwell allowed Jews to return when he was in power. But for a period of 500 years, England was what we could say Judenrein. There were no Jews there, and England had a long tradition of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness, and even though England has led Europe in terms of democracy, etc., nevertheless that stain has not been completely erased.
The difference between Ashkenazim and Sephardim are light skin and dark skin?
Ashkenazi are American Jews, and Sephardi are everybody else.
The difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi to me, like the East and the West, like, you know, European versus the Middle East.
The difference between Ashkenazi and Sephardi is the kind of fish they eat on Friday night. Ashkenazi eat gefilte fish, and Sephardis eat spicy Moroccan fish.
There are many differences. The main thing to remember, they all come from the same family, they're all from the same father.
The Sephardic community developed basically from the Jews of North Africa and Spain. There's a tradition that the Jews from the land of Israel that were taken into exile formed the basis for Sephardic Jewry, whereas the Jews of Babylonia formed the basis of the Ashkenazi community. That may be a broad overstatement. But the Jews of Spain and North Africa were the core of the Sephardic community. The Ashkenazi community was very small. It began in the Balkans. Jews that came from Babylonia came to the Balkans. And then from the Balkans it came to the Rhineland. And the centers of Ashkenaz in the 10th and 11th centuries were in the communities of Worms and Mainz and Spires. And then later in the Ile-de-France, in Troyes, and in Paris, Orleans, that's where the Ashkenazim lived. It's estimated that in the 12th century there probably were no more than 10,000 Ashkenazim in the world. The Sephardim were much more numerous. But the Ashkenazim, the word Ashkenaz is based upon the Hebrew word that was used for Germany. Ashkenazim moved east. Their basis was Germany. The language they developed, Yiddish, was a colloquial form of Low German, which they Hebraicized and made it their own dialect, their own language. And they continued to move east until they came to Poland and Lithuania, and eventually Russia, Hungary, Romania, Central Europe. And this group, the Ashkenazim, became the most numerous and the most influential group in the Jewish world. In 1939, before the Holocaust, there were about 12 million Ashkenazim in the world, 13 million Ashkenazim. The Sephardim, on the other hand, after the expulsion from Spain, had a difficult time in rebuilding themselves. And they moved all over the Mediterranean basin and into the Near East, Babylonia, Iran, etc. And they had a distinct, what shall I say, Arabic flavor to them, just as the Ashkenazim had a distinct Christian flavor to them. even though the Sephardim were never Arabs and the Ashkenazim were never Christians. But you take on the milieu of the society that you live in, of the country that you live in. And Sephardim also had a language of their own, Ladino, which was a corruption of Spanish and Portuguese and Arabic and Hebrew. And especially the Jews of Turkey always spoke Ladino as their basic language. Turkey, Greece, the Ottoman Empire. The Sephardim had an easier time, quote unquote, in the exile than the Ashkenazim did. The Muslim rule was never kind, but it was much more benign than the Christian rule. And the Sephardim did not undergo the great revolutions of the 19th century that the Ashkenazim did. They didn't undergo the Enlightenment, and they didn't undergo Reform, and they didn't undergo Musar, they didn't undergo the Hasidic movement, and to a great extent they didn't undergo the Holocaust either. And therefore they shaped differently. Their life experiences were different. Today in the land of Israel, we're all lumped together. And part of the process of the redemption here in Israel is that we have to learn how to live with one another, how to reconcile ourselves one to another. And yet at the same time, there's a strong emphasis on each group maintaining its own customs, its own traditions, its own view of life. And that sometimes causes friction, but many times it helps paint a very colorful picture of the Jewish people.
If the Jewish people had never existed, that's a hypothetical that is unanswerable.
I think the world would probably be more like ancient Rome.
You wouldn't have bagels and lox, you wouldn't have big noses, you wouldn't have banks, you wouldn't have Jewish mother jokes, you wouldn't have Jewish mothers.
There wouldn't be electricity and there wouldn't be knedlach.
We wouldn't have Hebrew National hot dogs and Sandy Koufax.
If the Jewish people had never existed, there'd be no E equals MC squared.
There's a little book, a famous little book called The Gifts of the Jewish People to the World. You know, it's hard to play that game. How would the world look without the Jewish people? But the main gifts, monotheism, the Hebrew Bible, the basis of moral civilization, those things would not be around. And really all of civilization is based upon those things. And then you have the contributions of individual Jews. I'm not talking about the 146 Nobel Prize winners, but the individual Jews over all of the centuries. The oldest medical school in Europe, in Montpellier in the Provence in France, was founded by Jews in the 11th century. Advances in every field of endeavor. Economics, science, history, literature. The Jews have been disproportionate. The entire story of the Jewish people is one of being disproportionate. That's why the world thinks that there's so many Jews. And it's hard for them to believe that we are so small in number because of the great influence and great accomplishments that the Jews have made to the cause of civilization. It's also probably true, in my mind at least, that there would be no Islam and there would be no Christianity if there were no Jews either. Jewish people have not existed. And we could probably be looking at a paganistic world, the same type of world that, for instance, exists in Asia until today. A world of idols and all sorts of superstitions that does not have the breadth and the understanding that monotheism brings to culture and to faith and to civilization. So the Jews have made themselves pretty indispensable in certainly in the Western world, in the history of the Western world and of the world generally, by the Torah and also by the individual contributions that Jews have made in every field of endeavor, in every field of human progress, in every field of human knowledge.